My name is Nadia, and I was 31 years old the night my father handed me an envelope across a restaurant table and told me my life was over if I walked down that aisle. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He slid it toward me with 2 fingers, the way you'd pass a check, and he said, "You marry him, you're done. No inheritance, no position, no place at this table. I want you to understand that clearly before you make a choice you can't undo." Marcus was sitting right beside me. He folded his hands on the table, looked at my father, and said, "We'll be fine." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I picked up the envelope, set it in my purse, and said, "Thank you for dinner, Dad." What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus had something tucked away that had nothing to do with a mop or a uniform or anything my father's world had ever bothered to look at twice. It was quiet. It was documented. And it had been sitting there for years, waiting for the right room. 1 year later, that room had 400 people in it. My father built his name on concrete and glass. That is not a metaphor. Harlan Voss had spent 35 years in commercial real estate development, and by the time I was old enough to understand what he did for a living, his name was on the side of 3 buildings in downtown Minneapolis and on the lips of every contractor, city planner, and commercial broker within a 200-mile radius. He was not famous in the way that actors or athletes are famous. He was famous in the particular, suffocating way that powerful men in mid-sized cities become famous, known to everyone who mattered in his world, accustomed to a specific kind of deference, and completely certain that his judgment about people was as reliable as his judgment about property values. He was not a cruel man, exactly. I want to be honest about that because the story I'm about to tell you is not the story of a monster. It is the story of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his children's lives were an extension of his portfolio and that a bad investment was something to be cut cleanly and without sentiment. My mother, Renata, was softer in her manner but rarely softer in her position. She had grown up with less than my father, had married into his world with both eyes open, and had spent decades becoming the kind of woman who belonged in it. She was gracious at dinners. She remembered everyone's children's names. She could move through a room of 200 people and make each person feel briefly, specifically attended to. She was also completely incapable of disagreeing with my father on anything that he had already decided. My sister, Petra, was 4 years older than me and had done everything correctly. She had gone to the right school, married a man my father approved of, a corporate attorney named Griffin who played golf and laughed at my father's jokes at precisely the right volume, and had produced 2 grandchildren in the regulation window. Petra was not unkind to me. She was something more complicated than unkind. She was certain, with the patient confidence of someone who had always been rewarded for her choices, that she understood how the world worked and that I simply hadn't learned yet. I was the one who had always been a little harder to place. Not rebellious, exactly. I wasn't the daughter who dyed her hair or failed her classes or brought home people designed to provoke. I was quieter than that. I had graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in urban planning, gone to work for a small municipal consulting firm, and spent my late 20s doing work that I found genuinely interesting and that my father found genuinely baffling. I was not on a path that led anywhere he recognized. I was not accumulating the right credentials or attending the right events or making the right kind of progress. And I was not, as far as anyone in my family was concerned, dating the right kind of person. I met Marcus Reyes in the lobby of a building I was consulting on, a mixed-use development in the North Loop neighborhood that was being retrofitted for updated occupancy codes. He was part of the building maintenance crew, working under a facilities manager named Dawn who I had been coordinating with for 6 weeks. Marcus was the one who actually knew the building. He knew which HVAC units ran cold in the east wing, which elevator shaft had the recurring drainage issue, which loading dock door had been shimmed incorrectly during a renovation 4 years earlier and had been slowly warping the frame ever since. I noticed him because he was precise. He didn't approximate. When I asked him a question about a particular section of the subfloor, he didn't give me the vague, slightly defensive answer I had come to expect from people who felt their territory was being assessed. He thought for a moment, then walked me to the exact location, crouched down, and showed me. We started talking. We kept talking. 3 months later, We were having dinner together twice a week, and 6 months after that I told my parents I was seeing someone. My father asked what he did. I told him. The silence that followed was not long. It was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be long because the position it represents has already been fully formed. Nadia, my father said. That's not serious. It is, I said. Another silence. Then, we'll talk about this later. We talked about it 4 more times over the next year, and each conversation followed the same shape. My father would present his position, measured, reasonable on its surface, framed always in terms of what was best for me and what I was risking and what kind of future I was building. My mother would add soft secondary notes. Petra would text me afterward with something like, I just think you should really consider what Dad is saying, he's not wrong about this stuff. And I would listen and nod and go home and see Marcus on Thursday. Marcus, for his part, was never agitated by any of it. I told him everything because I'm not the kind of person who compartmentalizes well, and because I thought he deserved to know. He would listen, and then he would ask me one of the same 2 questions. Either, what do you want to do? Or, are you okay? He never suggested that I was wrong to love my family. He never told me I should cut them off, or that they weren't worth the grief, or that I should choose. He just kept showing up on Thursday. He proposed in March, on a Saturday morning, in the kitchen of the apartment we had started sharing 6 months earlier. No restaurant, no audience. He had made coffee. He was still in the worn gray t-shirt he slept in. He sat down across from me and pushed a small box across the table and said, I want to marry you if you want to marry me. The ring was simple and not small. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my parents that afternoon. My mother said, Oh, Nadia. Just that. 2 words and a particular kind of exhale. My father said he'd like to have dinner with us. He named a restaurant, one of the good ones, the kind with a maitre d' who remembered his name. I knew what the dinner was. We went on a Friday evening in April. Petra and Griffin were there too, which I had not expected and which told me something about how the evening had been planned. The table was a round one in a private alcove near the back. It felt from the moment we sat down like a meeting that had already been decided. My father was courteous to Marcus in the way that powerful men are sometimes courteous to people they have already dismissed, asking questions with a cadence of interest, but the eyes of someone who has already moved on. What part of the building? How long have you been doing that? Thinking about anything else down the road? Marcus answered each one directly, without performing humility or performing anything else. He was just exactly what he was, sitting at a table that was trying to make him feel small, not taking the bait. Petra and Griffin talked mostly to each other and to my parents, the conversation flowing in the comfortable channels that families establish when everyone knows their place. I ate my dinner and watched the room. After the plates were cleared, my father reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. He slid it toward me. 2 fingers. The way you'd pass a document at a closing. I've had our attorney draft something, he said. It's not a threat. I want you to understand that. It's just clarity. If you proceed with this marriage, the arrangements I've made for your future, the trust, the stake in the property company, all of it, those are contingent on decisions I can still support. This would be a decision I can't support. I think you deserve to know that before you finalize anything. I looked at the envelope. I looked at my father. Across the table, Griffin was studying his water glass. Petra's expression was one I had seen before, not happy about the moment, but certain it was necessary. Marcus hadn't moved. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table, and he looked at my father for a moment, and then he said, quietly, "We'll be fine." My father nodded. Once, the way you nod when someone says something you've already discounted. "I hope that's true," he said. I picked up the envelope and put it in my bag. I thanked them for dinner. Marcus helped me with my coat. We drove home in the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable because it's full of something that didn't need to be said yet. I did not open the envelope that night. I opened it the next morning at the kitchen table with my coffee. It was what my father had described, a 2-page letter from his attorney outlining the revocation of a trust one had been named in since I was 19, along with the withdrawal of an offered partnership stake in Voss Development Group that had been discussed, though never formalized, over the previous 2 years. The numbers were substantial. The the kind of substantial that is designed to make a person reconsider. I read it twice. I set it on the table. I drank my coffee. Then I called the one person outside of Marcus who I trusted with the full picture. His name was Walter Reyes, Marcus's grandfather, 81 years old, living in a bungalow in St. Paul that he had owned since 1987. Walter had retired from 40 years of work in building trades and facilities management, and he was the quietest man I had ever met, in the specific way that people who have genuinely seen a great deal become quiet. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it counted. I had met Walter 4 months into seeing Marcus, over a Sunday dinner at his house, chicken and rice, a pot of beans, a radio in the kitchen playing something low. Walter had asked me what I did for work, and when I explained urban planning and infrastructure consulting, he had nodded slowly and said, "So you understand what a building actually is?" I said I thought so. He said, "Most people only see the surface." Then he passed me the rice. Walter had been warm to me from the beginning, in the measured, untheatrical way of a person who has learned to assess people slowly and then trust his assessment. And over the year that followed, he had become something I hadn't quite had before, an adult in my life who was on my side without needing anything from me in return. When I called him that Sunday morning, I read him the letter. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, there was a pause, and then he said, "Do you want to know what I think?" I said yes. "I think," he said, "that your father knows the price of everything and has never once learned what things are worth. And I think you already know what you're going to do." He was right. I did. We were married in September, at a small venue in the warehouse district, 60 people, exposed brick, Edison lights, long tables, good food. Marcus wore a charcoal suit that he had bought himself. I wore a dress that I had found at a vintage shop on Lyndale Avenue and had altered by a woman in my building named Rosa, who charged me $240 and told me I looked like the kind of woman who knew her own mind. My parents did not come. Neither did Petra and Griffin. My side of the tables held my closest friends from work, my college roommate Jess, a cousin named Diane who had driven from Milwaukee without being asked, and Walter, who sat at the head of the nearest table and wore a dark blue suit with a pocket square and looked, all evening, like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. When Marcus and I walked out at the end of the night, Walter pressed my hand and said, "You did well." I held on to that for a long time. The first months of our marriage were, in a way I hadn't anticipated, the quietest and most stable of my adult life. Not because everything was easy. My father and I did not speak for 4 months, and the silence had a weight to it that I felt in specific moments, specific rooms, specific phone calls I started typing and then deleted. My mother sent me a card at Christmas with a short note inside that said she loved me and hoped I was well, and that she thought of me, and that my father needed more time. I read it standing at the mailbox in the snow, and felt something tighten in my chest that I didn't try to name. Marcus worked. I worked. We ate dinner together almost every night. On weekends, we went to Walter's for Sunday lunch, and on the drive home, Marcus would have the radio on low, and I started to understand that this, the ordinary steadiness of it, was what I had been choosing. Not a fortune, not a position. This. I had moved, after we married, from the municipal consulting firm to a small independent practice I had started with a colleague named Priya. We specialized in adaptive reuse assessments, evaluating older commercial and industrial buildings for conversion potential. It was niche work, slower to build than I would have liked, but it was ours and it was growing, and by the following spring we had enough contracts to bring on a junior associate. Marcus, meanwhile, had quietly taken on more responsibility at work. He'd moved from site-specific maintenance to a supervisory role across 3 properties, and he had started spending his Thursday evenings at the kitchen table going over something I had, initially, not asked about directly. Spreadsheets. Property records. Numbers that had nothing to do with maintenance schedules. I asked, eventually. He looked up from his laptop and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are some things I've been meaning to show you." I was waiting until they were settled. I sat down. "Walter and I have been working on something for about 8 years, he said. "It started with a property he bought in the 90s that he never sold. Then another one. It's not what your father does. It's smaller, but it's real." He turned the laptop toward me. I looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. Then I said, "Marcus, how long has this been going on?" He said, "A while." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because I didn't want it to be part of the reason you were with me. I needed to know you were with me, because of me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a car went by on the street. I said, "I married you for you." He said, "I know. That's why I'm showing you now." I need to tell you about Walter, because Walter is the beginning of all of this, and the story doesn't make sense without him. Walter Reyes had come to Minneapolis from San Antonio in 1974, 26 years old, with a trade certification in HVAC and plumbing and $40 in his pocket. He had spent the next 15 years doing exactly what Marcus did, working in buildings, learning buildings, understanding them from the inside out in a way that most people who own buildings never do. He had also, quietly and consistently, been paying attention to something else. Property values. Specifically, in neighborhoods that other people weren't paying attention to. He had bought his first property in 1979, a fourplex in a part of St. Paul that his friends had thought was a questionable choice. He had maintained it himself because he could, and he had rented it at fair rates, and he had held it for years while the neighborhood changed around it. He had bought a second property in 1988, a commercial storefront on a block that sat between a declining area and a gentrifying one, and he had waited. He had bought a third in 1994. Walter had never told anyone outside his immediate family what he held. He lived in his bungalow. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He went to church on Sundays and had coffee with the same 3 men on Wednesday mornings and fixed things with his hands because he liked fixing things. He had also, over 40 years of quiet acquisition, built up a real estate holding that he had structured, over time, into a family LLC, with Marcus listed as a managing member since 2018 at Walter's direction, because Marcus was the one Walter trusted with its future. What Marcus had been sitting with, on those Thursday evenings, what he had been waiting until it was settled to tell me, was a development agreement that Walter's LLC had just finalized. The LLC, as the owner of record on 3 adjacent parcels in the Midway district of St. Paul, had entered into a joint venture with a regional developer for a mixed-use project that had been in negotiation for 2 years. The deal had closed in February. The groundbreaking was scheduled for October. The total assessed value of the 3 parcels, combined, was documented in the agreement at $4.2 million. Marcus was not a janitor who had secretly become rich. Marcus was a man who had always known exactly what he was, who had never needed anyone else to see it, and who had been waiting, without urgency, for the world to catch up. My father's new tower was called Voss North. It was the largest single development project he had undertaken in 20 years, a 12-story mixed-use building in the North Loop, the culmination of 3 years of planning and 18 months of construction. The ribbon-cutting event was scheduled for a Saturday in October, and it was by any measure the kind of event that my father had been building his entire career toward. I received an invitation 6 weeks before the event. It arrived by mail, a heavy card, embossed, addressed to me at our home address. My name only, not Marcus's. Below the event details, in my mother's handwriting, "I hope you'll come." It would mean a great deal to him, even if he doesn't say it. And to me, Mom. I set it on the counter and looked at it for a while. Marcus came into the kitchen, saw it, read it, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You should go." I said, "Should we both go?" He thought about it. Then he said, "Yes. I think we both should." I called my mother. I told her we would both be there. There was a pause on her end, brief and controlled, and then she said, "Of course. I'll make sure you're on the list." I didn't ask whether my father knew Marcus would be attending. I didn't need to. Walter called me the week before the event. "I want you to know something," he said, before Saturday. I said, "Okay." "The Midway project," he said. The developer filed the updated ownership documentation with the county last week. The building permit application was submitted under the joint venture name, and the managing member is on record. It'll be in the public registry by Friday. I said, "Walter, did you plan this?" A pause. Then he said, "I didn't plan anything. I just knew the timeline, and I thought you should know it too. He said it in the flat, even tone of a man who had spent 81 years watching things unfold at their own pace. I said, "Will you be there?" "At the event." He said, "I wouldn't miss it." The morning of the ribbon cutting, I wore a dark green dress that I had bought for a professional presentation and had been waiting for the right occasion to use. Marcus wore the charcoal suit from our wedding, with a new tie, a deep navy one, quiet and clean. We had coffee and drove to the North Loop with the windows down a little, the October air coming through cool and light, and I noticed that Marcus was the same as he always was. Same stillness. Same hands easy on the wheel. Whatever was going to happen in that room, he had already made his peace with it. The Voss North ribbon cutting was exactly the kind of event my father excelled at. The lobby had been staged with low floral arrangements and standing cocktail tables, and by the time Marcus and I arrived, there were already close to 400 people filling the space: contractors, city officials, commercial brokers, architects, journalists from the business press, 2 members of the city council. A platform had been set up near the far wall with a podium and a row of chairs. Enormous windows looked out onto the street. My father stood near the entrance in a dark suit, moving through the crowd the way he had always moved through crowds, unhurried, attended, present in the specific way of a man who knows that every room he enters is his room. He saw us. His expression didn't shift. He nodded once at me, and then his gaze moved past Marcus to someone behind us who was extending a hand, and he turned toward them. My mother found me within 3 minutes. She held both my hands and looked at my face and said, "You look well." And her voice was warm and a little careful, the way it always was when she was holding more than she was showing. She greeted Marcus with a kiss on the cheek and the kind of precise social warmth that didn't require her to feel anything she wasn't ready to feel. Then someone called her name from across the room, and she went, with a last small squeeze of my hand. Petra was there with Griffin. She found me 20 minutes in, near one of the cocktail tables, and her greeting was the version I had grown used to: genuinely glad to see me, and genuinely uncomfortable, and sorting through both at once. She hugged me. She said I looked great. She said something polite to Marcus about the building project he was working on because she had heard, somewhere, that he had a project. He answered her simply. She nodded and moved away to find Griffin. Walter arrived at 30 minutes past the hour, alone, in his dark blue suit. I saw him from across the room and felt something in my chest go steady. He moved through the crowd without hurry, stopping once to speak to an older man near the entrance who appeared to know him, and then making his way toward us. He shook Marcus's hand and then took mine in both of his and said, "How are you holding up?" I said, "I'm fine." He looked at me for a moment with the specific attention of a person who knows the difference between fine and fine, and then he nodded. "Good," he said. The program began at 6 o'clock. A representative from the city council spoke first, praising the development and its contribution to the neighborhood. An architect from the firm that had designed the building spoke next, briefly about the project's design principles. Then my father took the podium. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. He spoke without notes for 12 minutes, and the room was attentive the way rooms are attentive when the person speaking has earned his authority through decades of visible work. He talked about the project, about the neighborhood, about what it meant to build something that was meant to last. He was gracious. He was specific. He thanked the contractors by name, the city officials by name, his wife by name. He did not look in my direction. I stood near the center of the room, Marcus beside me, and I listened to my father speak about what it meant to build something that endured. I listened and I held my wine glass and I kept my face as steady as I could, and the whole time something in my throat was very tight. When the speech ended, there was applause, and then the room broke back into movement and conversation, and someone cued the music to a low level, and the waitstaff began circulating again. It was approximately 20 minutes after the speech that it happened. A man in a jacket with a city planning department lanyard was moving through the room with a tablet, pausing at small groups of guests and introducing himself. I recognized his role, a project coordination liaison, there to meet the stakeholders and key parties on record for the various development projects intersecting in the North Loop corridor. Voss North was one of several. The Midway joint venture was another. He reached us near the east end of the room, near the windows. He looked at his tablet, introduced himself, asked Marcus's name. Marcus said it. The man looked at his screen. Then he looked up. Then he looked at Marcus again. "You're the managing member on the Reyes-Voss joint venture?" he said. There was a half-second before the words fully registered. Not just for the man with the tablet. Nearby, close enough, a commercial broker named Dennis who had worked with my father for 15 years had caught the words. He turned. His expression shifted. He looked at Marcus. The liaison said, "The Midway Project, the parcel assembly on University Avenue. The LLC documentation went through the county Friday. I wanted to confirm because your name is showing as the primary managing member on a project we're coordinating with in the corridor, and I wanted to make sure I had the right person." Marcus said, "That's right." The man nodded, made a note, shook Marcus's hand, and moved on. But Dennis was still standing there. And then Dennis said, quietly, almost to himself, "Reyes. That's the group that bought out the Midway assemblage. 3 parcels, University and Prior. Walter Reyes." Marcus said, "My grandfather." Dennis looked at Marcus for a long moment. His expression was not unfriendly. It was recalibrating. "The LLC has been holding that land for almost a decade," he said. "Longer than that," Marcus said. Dennis made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then he turned, involuntarily, and looked across the room toward my father. "I want to tell you what I observed in the next 4 minutes, because it is the part of the story that I have gone back to most often, and the part that I find most difficult to describe accurately without using words I am trying not to use." Dennis crossed the room toward my father. I watched him go. I watched him reach my father's side and say something low into the side of the conversation my father was having. My father's posture changed. Not dramatically. A small shift, the kind that means the body has received information the mind is still processing. My father turned and looked across the room. At Marcus. I have never seen my father's face do what it did in that moment. I do not have the right word for it. It was not pale exactly, though the color in it changed. It was more like something that had been held very firmly in place for a long time simply stopped. He looked at Marcus, and then he looked at me, and then he looked at Marcus again, and whatever he had believed about the last 2 years rearranged itself behind his eyes in the space of about 4 seconds. My mother was standing beside him. I watched her receive the information secondhand, from the change in my father's face, from Dennis saying something further, from Petra, who had appeared at her elbow and was now listening and going very still. Griffin put his hand on Petra's arm. Petra looked at me from across the room. I held my wine glass. I did not move. I did not cross the room. I did not change my expression into anything. Marcus stood beside me in his charcoal suit, and he was the same as he had been all evening. Quiet. Still. Not performing restraint, just genuinely not needing the moment to be anything more than it was. Walter appeared at my other side. I felt his presence there before I looked at him. He was looking toward my father, and his face was completely unreadable, not cold, not satisfied, just still. The stillness of a man who planted something 8 years ago and has been watching the soil the whole time. I said, very quietly, "Walter." He said, I said, "Did you know the liaison would be here?" He said, "I knew the project was in the corridor. The rest was geometry." The next 30 minutes had a specific texture that I have never quite been able to reproduce in describing it to anyone. The event continued. The music kept playing. The waitstaff kept moving. The 400 people in the room kept having their conversations, and from any distance, nothing had visibly changed. But within a smaller radius, within the subset of people who now knew, things were moving. Dennis, I would later learn, had spoken to 2 other brokers in the room, both of whom had familiarity with the Midway project from its corridor planning stages. The name Reyes was known to them in the context of the assemblage, a patient, slow-moving land hold that developers had been aware of for years and had been waiting on. The connection to Marcus had not been made before, because Marcus Reyes, the building maintenance supervisor, and the Reyes LLC in the county records had existed in entirely separate mental categories for everyone in this room. Until now, those categories were the same person. My father made his way across the room toward me approximately 25 minutes after Dennis had spoken to him. He walked the way he always walked, measured, deliberate, not hurried. but his face, up close, had a quality I had not seen before. Careful. More careful than usual. He stopped in front of us. He looked at Marcus. He said, "Marcus, I understand you're involved in the Midway project." Marcus said, "My grandfather's been building toward that for a long time." My father said, "Your grandfather is Walter Reyes." Marcus said, "Yes." A pause. My father said, "I know the name." I didn't, he stopped. He started again. "I wasn't aware of the connection." Marcus said, "You didn't ask."
It was not said sharply. It was said the way you state a fact.
My father looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and what I saw on his face was not exactly regret, not yet. It was the particular discomfort of a man who is intelligent enough to have already followed the chain of logic to its conclusion, and is now standing inside that conclusion. He had handed his daughter an envelope at a restaurant table. He had told her she was choosing wrong. He had quantified what she would be giving up by marrying this man, the trust, the stake, the future he had arranged for her. He had stood in front of 400 people tonight and spoken about what it meant to build something that endured, and the man standing in front of him had been building something quietly for longer than most of the projects in this room had been conceived. My father said to me, very quietly, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." That was all I said. I wasn't cold. I wasn't sharp. I just let it sit there, true and plain, the way Marcus had taught me by example over 2 years. You don't need to twist the knife. The knife is already there. My father nodded, once, the way he nodded when a meeting had reached its natural end. Then he went back across the room. Walter watched him go. Then he put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "You want to head out soon?" I said, "Yeah. I think we're ready." We left before the formal close of the event. We said goodbye to Walter in the lobby, and he held both my hands again and he said, "You did well tonight." I said, "I didn't do anything." He said, "That's exactly what I mean." In the car, Marcus had the heat on low and the radio on low, and the Minneapolis streets were lit orange and amber in the October dark, and I sat with my hands in my lap and felt the specific, quiet quality of a moment that has already happened, not a moment you are still inside, but one you can feel settling into the past, becoming something solid and finished. I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Yeah. Are you?" I said, "I think so." He said, "Good." We drove home. The calls started Sunday morning. My mother called first, early, while I was still in my robe at the kitchen table. Her voice was carefully warm, more careful than warm, and she said she wanted to make sure I knew that what my father had said at dinner, the envelope, the ultimatum, she had not been comfortable with it at the time, and she wanted me to know that. I listened. I thanked her. I said I appreciated her calling. She said, "Do you think, is there a way, maybe, for all of us to have dinner?" I said, "Let me talk to Marcus." She said, "Of course. Of course." My father called that afternoon. He did not apologize, exactly. My father is not a man who uses the word sorry easily, and I did not expect him to. What he said was that he had spoken to Dennis after we left, and he had looked some things up, and he wanted to say that he had made some assumptions that he should not have made, and that he hoped I knew that his intentions at the time had been based on what he believed was true. I said, "I know that, Dad." He said, "The Midway project is going to be good for that corridor." I said, "Walter thinks so." A pause. Then he said, "Walter Reyes has been in this market for 40 years. I should have known who he was." I said, "You didn't look." He said, "No, I didn't." That was the closest we got, that Sunday, to what had happened. It was not enough, and it was also, for now, what was available. I had learned in the year of my marriage that sometimes you accept what people can give in the moment they can give it, and you wait to see if they can grow toward more. Petra sent a long text that evening. It had the shape of an apology and the texture of a rationalization, and it ended with, "I'm really glad he has a family that's going to be at those Sunday dinners with Walter." I read it twice and felt something in me that was not quite warmth and not quite forgiveness, and was probably the thing that lives between the two, which I don't have a clean word for. In the weeks that followed, some things changed and some things didn't. My father did not reverse the trust arrangement immediately. That took longer. What changed first was simpler. He called me more. Not long calls. My father is not a long call person, but regular ones. Tuesday mornings, usually brief and businesslike in their surface, checking in the way he checked in with people whose work he was paying attention to. He asked at one point about the adaptive reuse practice I had built with Priya. He asked specific questions, the right questions, the kind that showed he had thought about it. I answered them. He said, at the end of one of those calls, "You've built something solid." I said, "It's getting there." He said, "It's solid." I held on to that one too. Marcus and Walter and my father had a meeting in November, a real one, at a conference table about the Midway Corridor and how Voss Development's future projects and the Reyes LLC's holdings might intersect. I was not in the room. I didn't ask to be. What happened in that meeting was between three men who all understood property and patience, and whatever they worked out was their own. What I know is that Marcus came home afterward and made dinner, and when I asked how went, he said, "Good. Professional." Walter made him laugh once. I said, "Walter made my father laugh." Marcus said, "Once." I said, "What did he say?" Marcus said, he said, "Harlan, you know the difference between knowing a building and knowing its value?" And my dad said, "What?" And Walter said, "One of them is on paper." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "That's very Walter." Marcus said, "Yeah." Here is what I have come to believe in the time since that October evening. My father was not wrong that I was giving something up. He was wrong about what I was giving up. He thought I was walking away from security, from the version of the future he had spent decades building toward on my behalf. What I was actually walking away from was the premise that his assessment of Marcus had been correct. And those are not the same thing. What Marcus and Walter had built was not a refutation of my father's world. It was a parallel version of it, built on the same principles of patience and attention and the willingness to hold something for the long term, constructed by people my father had never thought to look at. Walter had been in the same market, the same city, the same industry for 40 years. He had been there the entire time. He was simply not the kind of person my father had thought to consider. That is not a story about money. It is a story about what you miss when you only look at surfaces. That's my story. An envelope across a restaurant table, a ribbon cutting in October, and 81 years of quiet patience that neither I nor my father had been told to look for. Here's what I want to ask you. Have you ever been in a room where someone found out they had underestimated the person they wrote off? And have you ever watched the moment they realized it? Was it in a boardroom? A family dinner? A parking lot after school event? What did the room do? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.